At the engagement party, Ethan Williams coldly told me it upset him to see me in a wedding dress. Then, in front of everyone, he ordered someone to strip me of my dignity in the most humiliating way possible. "Sarah Anderson," he scolded. "Don't you know Jessica has depression? Why do you keep provoking her? You're so heartless." Shame and embarrassment washed over me like a tidal wave. Desperately, I clutched at my clothes, begging him not to disgrace me further. But Ethan acted as if he couldn't hear, leaving the banquet with Jessica Smith cradled in his arms. Half a month later, Ethan finally remembered my existence, as if he were doing me a favor. "Sarah Anderson, stop being so calculating. Apologize to Jessica tomorrow and I'll still marry you." I stared at the crude, mocking messages on my phone. I didn't cry or lash out. I simply thought, "Ethan, I don't need you anymore." Later, Ethan appeared at my door. When I made no move to greet him, his patience quickly wore thin. "Sarah, this is such a small thing. Do you really have to be upset for 2 weeks? Maybe I was a little harsh, but you need to reflect on yourself. If you hadn't worn that dress and upset Jessica, none of this would have happened." His words became increasingly self-righteous as he spoke. Finally, he tossed a wilted rose onto the table as though he were offering charity. I silently picked up the withered flower. The thorns pricked my fingers, drawing tiny droplets of blood. It wasn't a sharp pain, but tears still began streaming down my face. Ethan had always known I loved flowers. Whenever we fought, he'd bring me roses, and I'd forgive him. It had become an unspoken truce between us. But now, the gesture felt hollow and meaningless. Seeing my reaction, Ethan's confident smirk faltered, his brows furrowing. "I've sent flowers and apologized. What else do you want from me?" he muttered. Noticing my pale face, he sighed heavily. "Fine, tomorrow you'll apologize to Jessica. After that, we can get married. Is that okay?" Each word felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into my heart. "Ethan," I said through gritted teeth, clutching my chest, "does this mean I can never wear a wedding dress as long as Jessica is around?" His expression darkened, and he slammed a fruit knife onto the sofa in frustration. The sharp tip grazed my skin, but he didn't seem to notice. Pointing at me, he shouted, "Wedding dress, wedding dress, wedding dress. Is there nothing else you care about besides superficial things? Haven't I treated you well these past few years? How can you be so selfish?" I opened my mouth to reply, but the tense silence was broken by the sound of his phone ringing. He answered immediately, his demeanor softening. "Ethan, I got the roses," a cheerful voice chimed. "But didn't we agree on 1,000 flowers? Why are there only 999? Ethan chuckled warmly. "You silly girl. Who sends exactly 1,000? I kept one back on purpose." After hanging up, he stood, straightened his jacket, and left without even glancing in my direction. The loud slam of the door echoed in the room, leaving me alone with my emotions. I sank to the floor, tears spilling over uncontrollably. The roses Ethan had given me were worthless, just like I was in his eyes. To him, Jessica was precious, while I was nothing more than a disposable container for things she didn't want. I clutched the roses tightly, the thorns pressing into the wounds they'd reopened. Blood and tears mingled as they dripped onto the floor. My body shook with sobs. How tragic that after all I'd sacrificed for him, what I received in return was humiliation and disdain. I met Ethan at a party years ago. Back then, he was just beginning to make a name for himself in the business world, and I was rising in the fashion industry. When my boss harassed me, Ethan appeared like a knight in shining armor. It was a cliched, hero saves the damsel moment, but I naively believed he was my prince. When Ethan confessed his feelings, he mentioned having a sister who was in poor health and needed his care. Thinking she was his biological sibling, I agreed to his terms without hesitation. Ethan had high expectations for women. He despised those who weren't virtuous, so I perfected my cooking skills, despite covering my hands in small cuts. He disliked women who flaunted themselves, so I gave up my career at its peak to support him. He didn't care for holidays or gifts, so I never asked for anything, not even on Valentine's Day. I worked tirelessly to become the ideal partner he wanted. Then Jessica returned from abroad, and everything changed. Ethan's priorities shifted, and I realized his so-called sister was anything but. After 5 years of effort and sacrifice, how could I lose to someone who had only been around for 3 months? Yet, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I faced public disgrace instead of celebration. One morning I woke to find Ethan cooking in the kitchen, a rare sight. I eagerly approached, hoping to share a moment of warmth, But when I reached for a dumpling, he slapped my hand away. "Didn't you say you like crabs? I got these just for you," he said, handing me a bag of cold takeout. Before I could reply, Jessica's cheerful voice echoed from the doorway. "Ethan!" she called, throwing herself into his arms. He held her tightly, brushing his nose affectionately against hers. My stomach churned as I watched their display. Suppressing my anger, I said coldly, "If you two can't control yourselves, the bedroom is just down the hall." Jessica finally noticed me and quickly stepped back, her tone apologetic but insincere. "Oh, sorry, sis. I'm used to being like this with Ethan. Please don't be mad." Ethan ignored me entirely, pulling out a chair for her and pouring her warm water. My mind flashed to times when I'd been in pain and begged Ethan for a simple gesture of care. His response had always been cold. "Stop being so dramatic. I'm busy." I realized in that moment that it wasn't that Ethan didn't know how to take care of others. He simply didn't think I deserved it. Jessica tilted her head, her eyes wide with mock innocence. "Sarah, was it true you were stripped in public? I saw a video online. I'm so sorry, I must have had an episode. How about this? Next time, let me check your outfit first so it won't happen again." Her feigned concern and thinly veiled malice were the final straw. The humiliation and anger I'd bottled up for months erupted all at once. "Who do you think you are?" I snapped, glaring at Jessica. "Do I need your permission to wear a wedding dress? If your depression means you can't handle seeing one, does that mean every woman in the world should run their choices by you before getting married?" Jessica's lips trembled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks like a broken dam. "I'm sorry," she whimpered. "It's all my fault, Ethan. Just let me die." Slap! The sharp sound echoed through the room as Ethan's hand met my face. Stunned, I clutched my cheek, staring at him in disbelief. His eyes burned with rage as if he could destroy me with a single look. "Apologize to her!" he roared. "Why should I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. Before I could say another word, Jessica stepped in front of me, her tear-streaked face the picture of heartbreak. "Ethan, don't blame her. It's all my fault," she sobbed. Without hesitation, she turned and hurled herself toward the wall. Ethan pushed me aside to catch her, the force sending me crashing into the furniture. I curled up on the ground, clutching my stomach as a warm dampness spread between my legs. My voice trembled with pain. "Ethan, I'm hurt. Please take me to the hospital." But he didn't even glance at me, carrying the unconscious Jessica away as if I didn't exist. When I woke, the sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air. A nurse stood by my bedside, rattling off instructions about post-miscarriage care. Post-miscarriage? My hand instinctively moved to my abdomen, now empty. The realization hit me like a blow. Ethan and I had a child I had once dreamed of, and now it was gone. And it was his negligence that had taken it from me. A coldness settled over me, spreading through every part of my body. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and typed a message. "It's over," Ethan called almost immediately. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. Jessica is in this condition because of you and you're throwing a tantrum? Are you that bored? Living like a spoiled little princess, causing trouble every day?" If this had been the past, I might have argued with him, desperately trying to prove my innocence or humbling myself to placate Jessica. But not this time. My voice was steady as I replied, "I'm serious, Ethan. Let's break up." There was silence on the line before he scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "Another one of your games? Fine, I agree. Just don't come crawling back later like a pathetic stray dog." In the background, I heard Jessica's delicate, pitiful voice. "Ethan, I feel dizzy." The call ended with the dial tone ringing in my ears. While packing my belongings, I realized how much I had accumulated over the years. Brand new couples' pajamas, matching toothbrushes, and a plaster figurine of Ethan and me that I had painstakingly made, all remnants of my unreciprocated devotion. Each item seemed to mock me. Shaking my head bitterly, I threw them all away. In the end, I packed only what truly belonged to me into a single suitcase. As I looked around the home I had shared with Ethan for 5 years, a memory surfaced, his expression when I first moved in. There hadn't been any excitement or happiness, just a strained smile masking clear annoyance. I'd been nothing more than an unwelcome guest from the start. To avoid any lingering complications, I announced the breakup in a group chat with our mutual friends. "Ethan and I are done. Please don't involve me in anything related to him again." With that, I deleted everyone connected to him from my contacts. At the airport, Ethan's voice cut through the noise. "Sarah!" His angry shout made my stomach turn, but I kept walking, disappearing into the crowd. "Stop!" he gasped as he caught up, grabbing my arm. "What do you mean by breaking up with me?" I pulled away, creating space between us. Ethan looked disheveled, his usual meticulous appearance replaced by messy hair and a wrinkled suit clutched in his hand. For the first time, he seemed genuinely desperate. "Ethan, if you don't understand, look it up in the dictionary," I said coldly. He stared at me, stunned into silence. When he finally spoke, his tone was softer, almost pleading. "Sarah, I've already booked a new wedding dress and set a date. It was supposed to be a surprise. Trust me, you'll be the most beautiful bride." His words felt hollow. Once, being his wife had been my greatest wish. Now it meant nothing. Seeing my lack of reaction, Ethan began rambling. "In a few days, it's Jessica's birthday. You need to bake her a cake with plenty of cream and a three-dimensional bunny design." His words filled me with such anger I almost laughed. "Ethan," I asked sharply, "what do you really think of me?" He frowned, confused. Before he could respond, a familiar voice interrupted us. "Sarah!" Jessica ran toward us, tears streaming down her face. "It's all my fault! Please don't leave Ethan because of me! I'll disappear if that's what you want! I'm sorry!" Her innocent, tear-filled eyes and trembling voice might have moved anyone else, but as she approached, her expression shifted and a malicious smirk appeared. "Losing a child must be unbearable, right?" she whispered, her tone laced with venom. My eyes widened in shock. How could she know? Jessica laughed cruelly. "Oh, didn't Ethan tell you? It was me. I arranged for your baby to be taken care of. Only I can give Ethan children. The one you carried meant nothing to him." Her words shattered the last pieces of my composure. Jessica crumpled to the floor, clutching her face as blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. Ethan, his face twisted with fury, moved to retaliate, but the security guard stepped in, holding him back. My gaze burned with anger as I stared at the pair who had so shamelessly conspired against me. Lifting my hand high, I let it drop with finality as I declared, "Ethan, make sure I never see you again in this lifetime. If I do, you'll pay for your sins in blood." Without sparing another glance, I turned on my heel and boarded my flight overseas. Ethan tried to stop me, but Jessica clung to him, refusing to let go until she collapsed in a faint. I walked away coldly, passing through the crowd and security, silencing my phone as I went. Moments later, a message from Ethan appeared. "Sarah, come back now, and I'll forgive this outburst." His words read like a master offering grace to a disobedient servant. I didn't respond. Instead, I deleted his contact information, as though erasing every trace of the love and obsession I had once felt for him. Since the scandal at the engagement party, I had been in a constant state of emotional turmoil. Now, for the first time, I felt a sense of release. Leaning back in my seat, I drifted into a dream. In the dream, a 25-year-old Ethan held my hand, promising me that I meant more to him than anything in the world. It was during the year his company faced financial ruin due to a bad decision, leaving it teetering on the edge of collapse. His business partners abandoned him one by one, and only I, his girlfriend of a year, stayed by his side. That winter was bitterly cold. We sat on the roadside, sharing a bowl of cheap noodles that cost just 6 yuan. Ethan covered my freezing hands with his and breathed warm air over them. "Sarah, I will never let you down in this life. If I do, I don't deserve to be buried." I laughed, scolding him for being so dramatic, but deep down I believed him. As long as he loved me, I thought I could endure anything. 2 years later, through our combined efforts, the company recovered. On that day, Ethan embraced me in the office, dropping to one knee with a trembling voice as he offered me a custom diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" I reached out to accept, but the scene blurred. The next thing I saw was myself kneeling in a banquet hall, helplessly watching Ethan carry Jessica away without looking back. Flashes from cameras blinded me as I cried out, "Ethan, don't go!" A soft voice pulled me out of the nightmare. "Ma'am, do you need a tissue?" I blinked, startled, and found a flight attendant looking at me kindly. She gestured toward my cheek. Confused, I raised a hand to my face and felt the dampness of tears. Silently, I cursed myself for being so weak. When I arrived in the U.S., it was late at night, and rain poured from the sky. After several failed attempts to hail a cab, I stood on the curb, tightening my coat as I debated returning to the hotel. Just then, a large umbrella appeared over my head. "What are you standing there for? Get in the car," a familiar voice said. My former agent had appeared, grabbing my luggage and heading toward the vehicle. Startled, I hurried to catch up. She hadn't spoken to me since I chose to leave the industry years ago. No attempts to stop me, no well wishes, just silence. Yesterday, I had sent her a message, unsure if she'd even respond. I hadn't expected her to show up. As I climbed into the car, my heart swelled with gratitude, though all I managed was a choked whisper. The emotions I had bottled up spilled over as I leaned on her shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. Her tone was strict but comforting. "Sarah, the fashion world isn't for the faint-hearted. If you want back in, toughen up, or I'll leave you behind." Her words brought me back to when I first entered the industry. She had been just as stern but always gentle, guiding me through my insecurities. Back then, my dream was to become a world-renowned supermodel. But after meeting Ethan, those dreams dissolved into illusions. What had I done to myself? I wiped my tears and lifted my head, resolve hardening in my gaze. Help me get back on stage. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Ethan was unraveling. Sitting in a private room with his friends, he was bombarded with questions. "Did you really break up with Sarah?" one of them asked. Ethan laughed dismissively. "She's just being dramatic. In a few days, she'll come running back, begging me to take her." But unease lingered beneath his facade. He had sent Sarah an invitation to a party, expecting her to show up in anger as she always did when provoked. 2 days had passed without a word from her. It must be her new tactic, he reasoned, convincing himself. After all, hadn't Sarah always loved him to the point of obsession? Typing out another message, Ethan warned, "Sarah, if you don't come back tomorrow, I'll throw all your things away." Feeling smug, he set his phone aside and drowned his insecurities in alcohol. Hours later, his gaze landed on a crumpled abortion report in the trash. Realization hit like a slap. Sarah had terminated their child. Rage boiled over as he frantically called her number, only to hear the repeated notification that the number was unreachable. That's when it dawned on him. Sarah had blocked him. The sound of laughter from inside the house made Ethan's mind race. Without hesitation, he burst into the bedroom, only to be greeted by a scene that stunned him. Jessica was sprawled on the bed, casually chatting on the phone. "That woman, Sarah, wants Ethan's child? It's laughable. Thank goodness you helped me," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. Ethan froze. "What depression," he muttered to himself, a wave of realization hitting him like a freight train. Was it all a ploy? Otherwise, how had Jessica manipulated him so thoroughly? His mind spun in a whirlwind of anger and doubt. "Sarah, I'm sorry. It's all Jessica's fault. Wait for me. I'll find you," he vowed silently. After a long day of shooting, it was nearly midnight when I stumbled across a small dumpling shop in Chinatown. Craving something warm, I decided to treat myself. The steam wafting from the dumplings hit my face, dizzying me slightly. It had been years since I'd eaten such comforting food. Ever since Ethan's financial collapse, he had grown to disdain street food, claiming it reminded him of his darkest days. Despite my chronic stomach issues, I had endured years of cold Western cuisine to accommodate him. Yet, when Jessica felt unwell, he would personally prepare porridge for her. Thinking about it now, I felt nothing. I was done compromising myself. Sarah, my agent, slid her phone toward me, revealing Ethan's name on the screen. He had sent over 200 frantic messages. "Should we respond?" she asked cautiously. I shook my head firmly. His actions are driven by nothing but possessiveness. Grabbing her phone, I blocked his number and even added his circle of contacts to the Do Not Disturb list. "You've really grown up," Sarah said, a note of approval in her voice. The next morning, insistent knocking jolted me awake. It was barely 3 a.m., hours before my scheduled shoot. Grumbling, I opened the door, only to come face to face with Ethan. His eyes were bloodshot, his disheveled appearance contrasting starkly with his usual polished demeanor. "Sarah!" he rasped, his voice hoarse but strangely affectionate. He stepped forward, his desperation palpable. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Don't be angry. Just come back with me." I remained silent, my irritation mounting. As I moved to close the door, Ethan pushed his way in, pinning me against the wall. "Jessica made a mistake with the baby, but she understands now," he continued, his tone pleading. "We can have children in the future." At the mention of children, my gaze turned icy. Even now, he defended Jessica, the woman who had orchestrated the loss of our child. Pushing him away, I glared at him with hatred. As long as Jessica parades naked through the streets of America, I'll consider going back with you. His face darkened. "You used to be so kind," he muttered, his voice laced with pain. No, he didn't want me. He wanted the obedient fool who had played the villain in his twisted love story with Jessica. Taking advantage of his stunned silence, I quickly called the building manager. Security arrived moments later, escorting Ethan out as he shouted, "Sarah, come home with me!" I closed the door behind him, sinking to the floor. I didn't want to cry, but the tears came anyway. "Cry it out," Sarah said gently. "But when you're done, you have to move forward." Ethan's sudden reappearance unsettled me, but I refused to let it derail my focus. Still, my unease grew. Could he be scheming something? I sipped my iced coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. Ethan valued his image too much to act recklessly. But Jessica? She had no such reservations. The phone call was brief, but damning. "We've found a more suitable candidate for the collaboration," the brand representative said. It was the 5th rejection in 3 days. After 2 frantic days, I finally secured a contract with a smaller brand, only to have the shoot canceled last minute. When I confronted the manager, he pulled me aside. "To be honest," he whispered, "people in the industry are afraid to work with you." This was sent to everyone. He showed me a photo on his phone, a disheveled image of me at the engagement banquet, humiliated for the world to see. "Mrs. Ethan sent it herself," he added quietly. My legs buckled and I collapsed to the floor. Rage boiled inside me. Those two had turned my life into a spectacle for their amusement. As I sat fuming, my phone rang. I quickly answered, ready for more bad news. Instead, a familiar voice sneered on the other end. "Sarah, I worked so hard to get your number!" Jessica's fake sweetness grated on my nerves. "Ethan and I are getting married. I just thought you should know." I hit the record button on my phone, keeping my tone neutral. "So, you're the one who sent those photos?" She giggled. "Of course. As Mrs. Williams, I have to protect everyone's reputation. Those stains on your image, they were just too much to ignore." Her tone turned sharper. "Next time, try not to embarrass yourself. Goodbye, Sarah." The call ended with a mocking laugh. "What now?" Sarah asked, worry etched on her face. I clenched my fists, determination burning in my chest. "Contact the best journalist you know," I said firmly. "I'm going to expose everything." Her eyes widened in shock. "Are you serious? That's insane!" I shook my head. Jessica's actions are backed by Ethan. He wants to prove I'll always be at his mercy, but I refuse to let him control my life any longer. My voice steadied as I added, "This ends now. My name is Sarah, and my life is my own." To break free from the deadlock, I decided to immerse myself in the situation. "Sarah, you're trending!" Sarah burst into the room, her excitement contagious as she twirled me around in celebration. In reality, being the topic of conversation means you have value. I bared my scars, revealing my most vulnerable self, and suddenly the world's eyes were on me. The narrative shifted. What was once mockery turned into a story worth telling. I became the infamous naked bride, a symbol of both humiliation and intrigue. I threw myself into various shows, sharing anecdotes about misguided romances, offering cautionary tales about falling into the traps of blind love. Slowly, public perception turned. Insults and ridicule morphed into admiration. "Sister is amazing," became the common refrain. The pain I once carried transformed into a badge of honor. 6 months later, I unexpectedly crossed paths with Ethan during a street photo shoot. He looked haggard, his once pristine appearance marred by weight loss and dark circles under his eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice raw, "I never realized losing you would hurt this much." Before I could respond, he suddenly pulled me into his arms. His grip was desperate, and I felt his tears dampen my shoulder. "I was wrong," he choked out. "Please, don't leave me. I didn't know about Jessica's lies. Please, forgive me." With a theatrical flourish, he produced a bouquet of roses from his pocket. The sight of those flowers ignited a fury within me that I could no longer suppress. My hand flew up, striking him hard across the face. Ethan staggered, stunned. But then he smiled faintly. "You hit me. That means I can't be mad at you anymore." Shaking out the pain in my hand, I met his gaze coldly. He had likely imagined countless scenarios where I'd run back into his arms, overcome with emotion. Or perhaps he thought I'd argue, only to succumb to his charm in the end. He never expected this. Me walking away without a backward glance. Ethan spiraled after that encounter. He would show up on set daily, showering me with roses, pleading for another chance. His efforts were nothing short of nauseating. After a week of relentless harassment, I decided to confront him. "Ethan," I said firmly, "you're almost 30. Let's face it, you have no better options than me. Why don't we get married next month?" For a moment, his arrogance flickered back. "Sarah, I'll change," he replied confidently. "We're meant to be together." I gave him a withering look. "You look like a stray dog begging for scraps." His face drained of color and his lips trembled as if searching for a retort. But no words came, only quiet, defeated sobs. The tables had turned, and now he was the one broken by his own pride. To deliver the final blow, I showed him a photo. His eyes widened in agony as he stammered, trying to explain. "It was Jessica! She seduced me!" Jessica, whom I had strategically placed nearby, suddenly intervened, launching into a dramatic confrontation with Ethan. Watching their chaotic fallout, I felt nothing but detachment. After returning home, I heard the aftermath from former colleagues. Jessica, using the child she claimed to carry as leverage, eventually coerced Ethan into marrying her. Initially, life was tolerable. Barely. Ethan no longer doted on Jessica, but for the sake of the baby, he endured. One day, everything unraveled. Ethan came home early to find Jessica entangled with another man. The betrayal shattered him. He thought of the child Jessica had cost me, and a rage unlike any other consumed him. In his anger and despair, he imprisoned Jessica, forcing her to terminate her pregnancy. This cycle of abuse repeated until a neighbor, suspicious of the commotion, called the police. When Jessica was finally freed, her condition was dire. Severe uterine damage, a detached retina. She had been pushed past the brink. Her parents took her back to her hometown, where she eventually married an elderly man in a remote village. Ethan's fate was equally bleak. With his company in shambles, he was sentenced to prison for his actions. "What do you think he was after?" a former coworker asked me one day. "He had it all and squandered it." I smiled faintly but didn't reply. Inside, a mix of emotions churned. Greed, perhaps, was Ethan's downfall. He always wanted what he couldn't have, even if it meant poisoning himself in the process. "Do you think he loved you or Jessica?" they pressed. After a moment of reflection, I replied, "Neither." Ethan's love had only ever been for himself. To him, Jessica and I were props, tools to elevate his ego and status. When his options ran dry, he turned to me, not out of love, but convenience. On the day I achieved international recognition, a peculiar gift arrived, a box of letters. The sender? Ethan, who had taken his own life. I didn't bother opening them. Instead, I handed the box to an old man who collected recyclables. "Sarah, you're on!" called the director. "Coming!" I replied, lifting the hem of my dress as I rushed forward. The path was thorny, but the wind carried promise. My future was radiant, and nothing could hold me back now.